What if a single mind could divide into thousands, each one carrying a piece of a hidden history? Imagine walking into a courtroom where one body took the stand, but dozens of voices emerged, each with its own memory, its own age, its own role. This was not fiction. This was Australia in 2019, and the case of Jeni Haynes, a woman whose mind split into more than 2,500 identities to survive a childhood designed for silence. Welcome to Gothic Ledger. Before we open this case file, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Write it down in the comments below. While you're here, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because the story you're about to hear is unlike any other, and you will not want to miss what comes next. This is not simply the account of a crime, it is the story of how memory reorganized itself into an archive no court had ever encountered before. Identities with names like Symphony and Muscles emerged to preserve what a single child could not carry alone. Decades later, they stood before a judge in Sydney's Downing Centre, each taking an oath, each testifying with precision. It was the first time in Australian legal history that a survivor's alters were recognised as witnesses in their own right. Across continents and decades, this case became more than one family's tragedy. It became a test of how the law records truth, how the mind preserves it, and how society responds when both collide. And so, let us step into the archive together. The ledger is open, the pages are waiting. In the western suburbs of Sydney during the late 1970s, a brick veneer house sat among streets designed for routine. Neat lawns, identical driveways, and the pulse of the school bell gave the impression of order. Inside, order took on another meaning, an infrastructure of repetition where silence carried the weight of survival. What appeared as the ordinary trappings of a suburban family home became the setting where secrecy became its own architecture. Rooms held to strict patterns. The kitchen produced meals at predictable intervals. The hallway carried footsteps, measured and deliberate, and the front door rarely opened without calculation. Locks were more than security. They were signals of containment. Utility bills and school timetables charted a family life on paper, yet beneath these records lay an internal economy of fear. A child, unable to reconcile the dissonance between what was seen and what was endured, developed a method of division. Memory became too heavy to hold in a single ledger, and so it split into many pages. This defensive filing system began in the smallest ways. One part of the mind recorded the sounds of shoes on tiles, another stored the color of curtains or the smell of detergent. Each detail was archived separately, sealed off from the unbearable whole. Over time, the divisions grew in number and purpose. The architecture of the house and the architecture of the mind mirrored each other. Closed doors, hidden rooms, compartments meant to keep knowledge apart. It was not imagination. It was engineering born of necessity. The monotony of school days further masked the divisions. Attendance slips and report cards confirmed presence, yet the child who sat at a desk was already plural inside. The classroom was no escape, only another arena where separation kept daily function intact. Teachers saw a quiet pupil, while unseen identities kept the eye's interior record intact, each holding fragments that could not be destroyed. Silence was not emptiness, it was active preservation. By the early 1980s, this system was no longer a child's improvisation, but a full infrastructure of memory. Just as the suburb's streets curved predictably around cul-de-sacs, the mind turned inward, creating safe corridors where unbearable truths could be stored. This was not visible to neighbors or documented on the utility statements filed in a drawer, but it existed with the same precision as any civic plan. The ledger was being written, though no paper carried its entries. What remained visible to outsiders was a household that appeared disciplined, consistent, and unremarkable. To those who lived inside, the design was different. Silence as scaffolding, secrecy as the very walls. The mind's subdivisions began as defense, but they also became the only archive capable of holding events that no exterior institution acknowledged at the time. On a shelf in that house, among outdated telephone directories and folded neighborhood maps, lay the outward record of an ordinary family. Yet behind those papers, in the recesses of a divided consciousness, another ledger was already alive, quietly multiplying page by page. In the aftermath of early fragmentation, the mind became less a single narrative than a catalogue. This catalogue was not abstract, it was structured, purposeful, and precise. Psychiatrists later called it dissociative identity disorder, but at the time it was a child's only method of preservation. Where one consciousness would have collapsed under pressure, thousands of separate partitions arose, each carrying a specific task. The number has been cited in records only once, and it is staggering, but the figure alone obscures the deeper function. These were not random divisions, they were deliberate pages in a system designed for survival. Some identities specialized in sensory storage. They retained the look of a hallway, the pattern of a linoleum floor, the cadence of a parent's voice when the front door closed. These fragments were not connected into a single memory, but filed in separate compartments where they could be retrieved without overwhelming the whole. Others held chronology, a calendar of events, marking the sequence in which days unfolded, offering a backbone of time when continuity threatened to dissolve. Still others were built for presentation. They carried the child through classrooms, playgrounds, and polite exchanges, ensuring the external world saw only composure. This distribution was not chaos. It was engineering. Each identity had a defined role, one to observe, another to endure, another to interact. In later proceedings, the system's organization would astonish experts who understood how dissociation normally presented. Here, the divisions were too numerous to count, and yet interlocked in a way that gave stability rather than collapse. The ledger of memory, spread across thousands of hands, became not a weakness but a record that could survive across decades. The ages of these parts were varied. Some remained fixed at 4 or 5 years old, stories tell, early sensory impressions with the clarity of a child's vision. Others grew older, reflecting teenage resilience or adult pragmatism. The mind permitted age to freeze or advance depending on what the archive required. This is why, in later testimony, the court encountered voices and perspectives spanning childhood through adolescence, all contained within one body. Each spoke from the vantage of the age at which they had first been called into being, holding information as though time outside had not moved. What emerged was not a single diary, but an entire filing room. Thousands of compartments, thousands of silent custodians, each entrusted with a portion of truth too dangerous to hold in one place. It was this distributed storage that allowed the survivor to function across years without disintegration. Later recognition in an Australian courtroom would confirm what psychiatry had already noted. Multiplicity here was not evidence of disorder, but of survival. In the silence of those early years, a mind had reorganized itself into something resembling an archive. To outsiders, nothing could be seen. To the survivor, everything was preserved. On the surface, a report card noted satisfactory attendance. Within, 1,000 archivists worked quietly, ensuring no page was ever lost. And in that hidden catalogue, unseen, unheard, the ledger of names continued to expand, waiting for the day its record would be read. Among the earliest partitions, one figure emerged with the task of recording what no single child could hold. She was known in later proceedings as Symphony, an identity fixed at the age of 4. Her purpose was not to play or to imagine, but to preserve. She became a custodian of sensory detail, ensuring that the smallest fragments of lived reality remained intact. Symphony catalogued light. She carried the memory of sunlight filtering through curtains at certain hours of the morning, the way motes shifted when footsteps disturbed the air. She stored the pattern of tiles in the kitchen floor, the slight crack in the plaster above a doorway, and the cadence of the school bell that signaled the end of lessons. Each of these impressions was sealed and maintained without interpretation. For a developing mind forced into division, Symphony represented pure observation. Routine provided her with material. She remembered the clink of cutlery at set times, the repetition of meal preparation, the sound of water running through the pipes at night. Where others in the system stored chronology or carried the weight of endurance, Symphony retained the sensory world of childhood in exacting detail. This was not sentimentality, it was necessity. By recording texture, sound, and sequence, she made possible a ledger that could later be corroborated. Decades afterward, those records resurfaced not as fragments of fantasy, but as forensic anchors. When testimony was called for, Symphony's clarity gave structure to the past. Her contributions were not dramatic statements, but precise reconstructions of rooms, times, and atmospheres. Such details, impossible to invent with consistency, confirmed the reliability of a system once dismissed as disorder. In court, when she was recognized by name, the fact of her existence affirmed the depth of the archive within. Symphony's age never advanced, says. He remained a 4-year-old in memory and perspective, unchanged by passing decades. This stasis gave her the peculiar strength of permanence. While the outer body grew into adulthood, Symphony continued to carry the same early vantage point, unaffected by the erosion of ordinary recollection. Her testimony, when translated into adult language, bore the crispness of memory unblurred by time. To clinical eyes, Symphony embodied the logic of dissociation. She was not an error or a symptom, but an engineered solution. In moments when the whole mind might have fractured, she stepped forward to collect impressions, leaving others free to endure or conceal. Her name itself, publicly cited in records, signified more than individuality. It suggested a role in harmony with the rest, a voice among many designed to maintain coherence. In the larger archive, Symphony was a minor figure, one of thousands. Yet her significance lay in the precision of her account. When sunlight through curtains became part of legal testimony, it was Symphony's work that made it possible. On a later transcript, her name appeared in black ink beside the age of 4. It was not accompanied by description or embellishment, only the bare identification of a recorder who had done her task. And in that understated entry, a child's vantage point became part of history's record. Among the multitude of internal figures, one identity held a particular assignment: to stabilize the body when the rest of the system fractured. Known in records as Muscles, this persona appeared not as a fighter, but as a brace, a structural support when others faltered. He carried the frame of a teenager, built not for memory collection or for public functioning, but for steadiness itself. Muscles governed posture. When fear threatened to collapse the body inward, he kept the spine aligned and the gaze forward. His presence was marked by controlled breathing, an even rhythm that calmed the physiological signs of panic. In moments where the body might have signaled distress too strongly, Muscles regulated, ensuring composure remained visible to the outside world. This was not defiance, it was containment. His role was to hold the vessel steady so others could continue their specialized work. Later proceedings would reveal how indispensable this function became. When testimony was required, Muscles managed the physical act of being in the witness box, hands unclenched, shoulders squared, eyes lifted. He was not the archivist, nor the historian of sensory detail, but the scaffolding that allowed those voices to be heard. Without him, the act of testifying might have collapsed under the weight of fear's bodily imprint. With him, answers could be delivered in measured sequence, each word supported by the stillness he imposed. The teenage form was significant. Muscles did not remain a small child like Symphony. He grew into adolescence, carrying the bodily strength that childhood lacked. This development reflected his task, to embody endurance at a stage of life when physical steadiness could realistically emerge. He became the point of balance within the system, ensuring the collective could present itself when called upon, whether in daily life or in the formal structure of a courtroom. Reports from the sentencing hearing noted his presence in victim impact materials, where Muscles' stability was central. When others recounted memories, he supplied the composure to withstand the moment. His contribution was not visible in transcripts as words of his own, but in the poise with which statements were delivered. Observers could not always name him, but his effect was unmistakable. Testimony held its shape because he held the body still. In clinical understanding, muscles represented dissociation's pragmatic side. Where some alters carried trauma, he carried regulation. He was less a character than a function, proof that the mind, under pressure, can construct mechanisms not just for remembering, but for presenting. He showed that survival is not only about storing the unbearable, but about maintaining the capacity to appear coherent when coherence is demanded. On the court record, Muscles was acknowledged by name, his role was documented, his presence formally recognized. But the true measure of his contribution was not in words, but in silence. The silence of a steady breath, a straightened posture, a body that did not collapse. And so, in the archive of many, Muscles stood as the brace, unseen by most, essential to all, the quiet stabilizer without whom the record might never have been spoken. In the mid-1970s, a family crossed hemispheres. Official records show a shift from Bexleyheath, southeast London, to Sydney, New South Wales, around 1974. The reasons were not inscribed in public detail, only that a relocation was undertaken, passports stamped, and a new address registered thousands of miles from the old. The outward evidence suggested a fresh start, the kind of post-war migration common to many families seeking opportunity in Australia. For one child, the transition coincided with an age too young to mark the difference between countries, but old enough to sense continuity in what remained unchanged. Immigration forms listed dates and names. Flight or shipping manifests bore routine entries, ages of children, occupations of parents, the promise of resettlement. These papers described the family in neutral terms, yet they concealed the patterns already set in motion. A house in London, a house in Sydney, different in structure, similar in function. Where the environment changed, the interior design of control endured. The child who would later become the subject of unprecedented legal recognition was around 4 years old. At this stage, identity divisions had already begun to form, early custodians like Symphony arising to store unbearable fragments. The move overseas did not dismantle that structure. Instead, the system traveled intact, carrying its unseen catalogue across borders. A new country offered new neighbours, a new school, a different accent on the streets. But inside the household, silence remained the primary language. School enrollment in Sydney confirmed attendance soon after arrival. Records listed grades, teachers and addresses, evidence of assimilation into a new system. To observers, this appeared as a successful migration, a child placed in education, a family absorbed into suburbia. Yet behind those documents lay an interior truth that geographic distance had no power to erase. The very same routines once embedded in a London house were now carried out under the southern sun. Later testimony would stress this continuity. Abuse, as formally described by the court, began in the UK and resumed in Australia without interruption. This emphasized the reality that movement across oceans did not sever the internal ledger's work. Instead, the system of identities became further entrenched, adapting to a setting that outwardly promised new beginnings, but inwardly replayed old patterns. By the early 1980s, Sydney had become the backdrop for the most concentrated years of trauma, lasting until roughly age 11. The move, once imagined as a pivot in family history, was in fact only a relocation of place, not of practice. Today, only the records remain, an immigration stamp from 1974, a change of address notice, a school enrollment card in a Sydney district file. Each artifact looks ordinary, bearing nothing unusual beyond a date or a name. Yet, to the survivors' later reconstruction, these forms stood as reminders that continents may shift, but design does not. Continuity preserved in silence. And on a folded map of suburban Sydney, creased from years of storage, the new address appears inked in blue. The paper endures, flat and unremarkable, yet it marks the ground where the ledger continued to grow. Court records later described the structure of domination not as spontaneous, but as deliberate. The judge called it planned, calculated, depraved, and abhorrent, phrasing chosen to capture the patent quality of the harm. This was not chaos, but architecture. The home itself operated as a mechanism where routines, rules, and punishments built a framework of control that repeated with mechanical precision. Grooming was the foundation. Each interaction was rehearsed until compliance became predictable. Small gestures of approval were rationed. Silence was enforced as discipline. Isolation deepened the structure. Contacts outside the family remained limited. Neighbors saw little beyond the facade of suburban order, and teachers noted attendance without suspecting what stood behind it. Repetition became its own camouflage. Acts performed again and again left no visible rupture in the outward family record. They were concealed by the very normalcy of their scheduling. Conditioning followed. The child learned responses in advance, anticipating outcomes before they occurred. This anticipation was itself part of the architecture. It trained obedience while rendering resistance futile. In the judge's view, these cycles proved that the abuse was no accident, no singular episode, but a sustained program whose intent was to dominate completely. The effect was cumulative. By the time external authorities could have intervened, the pattern was already ingrained into daily life. Humiliation reinforced compliance. It was administered as ritual, a means of teaching subordination and erasing confidence. Yet even here the mind adapted. Within the system of altars, some identities stored the humiliations in detail, while others were built to remain outwardly unshaken. The architecture of control was met by the architecture of dissociation, a counterstructure designed to withstand what the child could not alter. The house itself served as the perfect device. Locks, corridors, and closed rooms became instruments of regulation. Meal times, school runs, even bedtime carried the weight of a schedule used to enforce submission. Paper records of utility bills, neighborhood maps, and school reports suggested nothing unusual, yet beneath them, a different order dictated the rhythm of life. Control thrived not because it was hidden, but because it was ordinary enough to pass unnoticed. The judge's sentencing remarks returned to this theme: repetition and calculation. What occurred did so with intent, and intent was what made the crimes not only horrific but architectural. Each act fitted into a larger design, a framework that endured across years, countries, and settings. From an evidentiary perspective, the pattern mattered more than any single event. The consistency allowed memory, dispersed among altars, to align later into a coherent narrative. What one identity retained, another could corroborate. In this way, the machinery of control unwittingly produced the conditions for its own eventual exposure. On the public record, the architecture is visible only in judicial phrasing and sentencing notes. No blueprint survives, no diagrams of rooms or timetables. What remains is language: planned, calculated, depraved. These words stand as the only visible map of a house once designed to control. And in the case file, beneath the judge's remarks, a date-stamped transcript rests. It is plain, typed in black ink, yet it is the closest thing to a floor plan of how domination was built. In Sydney, between the ages of 4 and 11, time settled into a loop. School terms began and ended, seasons rotated, and neighbors observed nothing more unusual than the ordinary life of a suburban child. Yet within this framework of predictability, an internal system of fragmentation deepened. The daily cycle itself, bell times, attendance slips, medical absences, concealed the reality of what was occurring behind closed doors. Registers show the child present in classrooms year after year. Names ticked off in neat lines suggested continuity, a steady passage from one grade to the next. Teachers wrote brief comments noting effort or silence, recording the outward signs of progress. On paper, nothing broke the pattern, but it was precisely this repetition that allowed the inner divisions to grow stronger. Each day mirrored the last, creating a closed circuit where secrecy was preserved by the normalcy of routine. Medical records add another layer. Occasional absences, explained as illness or minor injury, punctuated the otherwise unbroken attendance. To an observer, these interruptions were ordinary. To the interior system, they became markers, points at which certain identities surfaced to carry what others could not. The body was accounted for in official documents, but the mind was already plural, assigning duties across its growing archive. Neighborhood memory confirms the ordinariness. Streets were filled with the sound of children riding bicycles, families tending gardens, and weekend gatherings. Within this environment, the household appeared aligned with community life. Nothing in its outward appearance suggested the calculated domination later described by the court. The camouflage was effective because it blended into a larger landscape of repetition. The home was just another address on a quiet street, indistinguishable from its surroundings. Inside, the third child's mind adapted. With each passing year of the circuit, identities multiplied. Some handled the daily routines of school, others stored sensations or chronology, and still others endured what could not be voiced. Fragmentation was not breakdown but strategy. It allowed presence to be maintained in public spaces, while truth was distributed across hidden compartments. This was the architecture of dissociation, an archive engineered by necessity during the most formative years of life. By the end of this period, the system was firmly established. Thousands of identities existed, each created to manage an aspect of the closed circuit. The outward record remained seamless. School reports filed, vaccinations noted, attendance maintained. To institutions, the child appeared consistent, progressing as expected. Yet beneath those records, another continuity persisted, one that only decades later would be recognized in a courtroom when the hidden archive was finally opened. On a shelf in an old school file rests a dated report card from this period. The handwriting is careful, the comments routine, the marks unremarkable. It records presence, effort, and progress. It does not, and could not, record the fact that by age 11 the child was no longer singular. Within the closed circuit of routine, fragmentation had already become the foundation of survival. When the closed circuit of childhood finally loosened, a new structure emerged: education. For most, a university degree is a passage of a few years. For this survivor, the process extended across 18 years and became a form of counter-engineering. What had once fractured into thousands of compartments was gradually given language, classification, and theoretical context. Books, libraries, and lecture halls became the architecture through which hidden history could be reassembled. The first field was psychology. Here the mechanisms of harm could be studied as models, case studies, and diagnostic categories. What had once been endured in silence was now translatable into terms recognized by clinical literature. Course timetables charted progress through foundational units, and library cards bore the stamps of constant borrowing. Each semester extended the capacity to name what had previously been unspoken. From there, the path turned toward legal studies and criminal justice. The purpose was not only to understand harm, but to understand systems, the way laws frame evidence, the ways courts recognize or dismiss testimony, the structures by which justice is either granted or denied. Assignments and essays became practice in the language of authority, a rehearsal for the day when personal history would itself stand in a courtroom. The work culminated in a doctorate focused on victims of crime. Thesis abstracts describe a meticulous investigation into how trauma is processed, remembered, and recognized within legal contexts. Here, academic rigor intersected with lived experience, though the latter remained largely invisible to examiners. What mattered was that the survivor had acquired both languages, the clinical terminology of psychology and the procedural vocabulary of law. These became tools of translation, allowing fragmented memory to be structured as coherent teasers in timony. The span of these years was not incidental. 18 years of tertiary study meant persistence through multiple degrees, each layer reinforcing the last. It was education as slow construction, deliberately building a framework strong enough to hold the weight of disclosure. In this sense, university was not escape, but reconfiguration. The same instinct that had divided memory into safe compartments now reassembled it into categories sanctioned by academia. Records of this long pursuit still exist: marked essays, supervisor comments, library borrowing slips, and the final parchment of graduation. Each is an artifact of a larger process, a map of how knowledge became a counterweight to silence. These documents chart not only intellectual growth but the gradual acquisition of authority, the capacity to speak in languages institutions would accept. In later public statements, the survivor described these years as essential to survival. Without education, there would have been no vocabulary to explain the multiplicity, no terminology to defend it against dismissal. With education, what had once been only internal became something the outside world could be compelled to hear. On a desk, preserved from those years, rests a graduation certificate placed beside a worn notebook filled with penciled annotations. One is formal, embossed and signed. The other is personal, pages worn thin from use. Together they embody the two sides of exfiltration: recognition by an institution, and the quiet record of a mind rebuilding itself page by page. When disclosure finally reached authorities, the private archive built across decades intersected with the formal machinery of the state. What had been preserved internally by division was now translated into statements, file notes, and cross-border correspondence. Police opened a historical inquiry that stretched backward into the 1970s, gathering fragments of evidence that were as dispersed as the survivors' own memories. The inquiry was protracted. Officers compiled reports that linked incidents in Bexleyheath, UK, with those later carried out in Sydney, Australia. Case files bore dates spanning decades, creating a paper trail that connected two continents. Requests for assistance were dispatched through official channels, and in time, the investigation reached across borders. It was not only an inquiry into an individual's actions, but into the continuity of a pattern that had survived migration. Extradition became the crucial step. By the mid-2010s, the accused was located in the United Kingdom. Australian authorities, working with their British counterparts, sought his return to face charges. Court documents confirm that in 2017, extradition was approved. The transfer was not simply a logistical matter. It was the moment when private testimony acquired the force of international law. The survivor's internal record, preserved by thousands of identities, was now matched by the physical transfer of the accused across oceans. Back in Sydney, the case entered the legal system formally. Prosecutors prepared a brief of evidence that drew heavily on testimony, supported by the meticulous consistency of sensory and chronological details preserved since childhood. Given the scale of the allegations and the profound risk of re-traumatization, the court elected to proceed by judge-alone trial. This meant a single judicial officer would receive the evidence, weigh its credibility, and render judgment. The choice was strategic: to spare the survivor and her system from the scrutiny of a jury, while ensuring the case was evaluated with legal precision. Interviews were conducted with measured care. Chronologies were cross-checked, locations verified, and statements typed, signed, and filed. Each interview became part of a growing dossier, a state archive designed to mirror the survivor's own. The difference lay in format. Where the mind had stored impressions in fragments, the police collated them into statements, exhibits, and procedural timelines. Chain of custody logs documented the handling of evidence. Forms bore signatures at each stage, noting the movement of files, the recording of statements, the custody of exhibits. This bureaucracy was deliberate, its formality intended to ensure that what had once been unspeakable could withstand legal scrutiny. The investigation culminated in a docket prepared for the Downing Centre District Court. By the time proceedings commenced, the state held a structured record: interviews, transcripts, extradition orders, and medical assessments. It was a file that transformed private history into public evidence. Among these papers rests a stamped intake sheet, bearing date and file number, plain in appearance yet central to the case. It marks the point at which a lifetime of concealed experience entered the machinery of justice. From that moment, the private ledger of memory and the state's ledger of law were bound together. When the proceedings began at the Downing Centre District Court, the institution found itself confronting a form of evidence it had never before accommodated. The survivor did not arrive as a single narrator, but as a system of identities, each carrying its own ledger of memory. For the first time in Australia, the courtroom adjusted its procedures to recognize multiplicity not as confusion, but as structure. The oath-taking process was the first adaptation. Ordinarily, a witness affirms to tell the truth once. Here, each identity permitted to testify was acknowledged separately, each given the formality of swearing in as custodian of its own record. This was not handled as spectacle but as necessity, a way to ensure that every portion of testimony carried the same legal weight. The court did not treat these voices as fragments, but as distinct archivists of the same history. Pacing became equally important. Testimony unfolded at a tempo adjusted to the demands of the system itself. Breaks were scheduled more frequently than in standard trials, recognizing the strain of shifting between identities and the burden of prolonged exposure to questioning. Sessions were shortened, adjournments extended, all to preserve the clarity of evidence while minimizing re-traumatization. The courtroom became a space not only of adjudication, but of careful timing, calibrated to the rhythms of memory itself. Seating arrangements also shifted. The witness box, ordinarily fixed in position, was treated with more flexibility. Counsel and court staff allowed for pauses, for adjustments in posture, and for moments of silence when one identity receded and another emerged. This choreography of accommodation was deliberate. It acknowledged that testimony would not arrive in a single voice, but in many, each with its own cadence and emphasis. Observers noted the unprecedented nature of these modifications. Media reports described it as the first case in the country where multiple identities were permitted to testify in court. Legal commentators pointed to the significance. By adapting procedure, the judiciary affirmed that dissociation was not obstruction, but evidence. It showed that the law could stretch to meet a form of truth preserved in extraordinary conditions. The judge presiding over the matter guided this evolution with restraint. Each adjustment was recorded, documented, and justified, ensuring that innovation remained consistent with fairness. By accommodating the system, the court did not bend the rules but clarified them, demonstrating that the purpose of procedure is not rigidity, but the reliable collection of truth. For the survivor, this recognition carried weight equal to the sentence that would later follow. A structure once dismissed as disorder was now validated as a legitimate archive. The courtroom had learned to listen to multiplicity not as disruption, but as testimony. In the official record, these adaptations are noted in procedural language. Breaks granted, oaths taken, accommodations allowed. They read plainly, without flourish. Yet behind them lies a landmark moment in Australian legal history. On the courtroom wall, a clock measured each interval of testimony. Its hands marked not only the passing of hours, but the careful pacing that allowed the system to be heard. In that measured rhythm, law adjusted itself to memory's design. When testimony concluded, the official record was clear in its weight, but less precise in its count. Different reports offered different numbers, reflecting the difficulty of cataloguing multiplicity in legal form. Some outlets described 6 identities as having taken the stand directly, each sworn and questioned in turn. Others cited 33 identities embodied across victim impact statements, recounting their experiences as part of a larger whole. This variance was not inconsistency, but reflection of complexity. Dissociation is not easily translated into court procedure or into media shorthand. Each identity that appeared was not a performance, but a custodian of evidence, entrusted with a fragment of memory or a dimension of endurance. Whether 6 or 33 were publicly acknowledged, all belonged to the same system, preserving the same ledger of harm. Documentary sources later emphasized the historic character of this process. For the first time in Australia, a survivor with dissociative identity disorder testified with multiple identities, and the court recognized their contributions as admissible. Legal commentators noted that it was less the exact number that mattered than the precedent. The judiciary accepted multiplicity as credible evidence. The survivor's mind, once forced into division, had become an archive the law was willing to open. The media's focus on numbers, however, risked obscuring this point. Headlines favored tallies, 6 on the stand, 33 in statements, as if the significance lay in arithmetic. Yet the meaning was functional, not numerical. Each identity carried a precise role. One held sensory detail, another chronology, another strength. Collectively, they built a testimony no single witness could have sustained. The ledger was written by many hands, but it told a consistent story. Courtroom observers described the transition as measured, supported by breaks and adjustments in pacing. What might have appeared unusual in another setting was here treated with solemnity. Each identity was afforded the dignity of recognition. Their statements entered into the transcript alongside those of prosecutors and defense. The procedural formality underscored the seriousness with which the court approached testimony that stretched beyond conventional boundaries. In later years, the survivor herself underscored that multiplicity was not spectacle but survival. To count identities was to miss the greater fact that a system had been built to preserve truth when one mind could not. Whether 6, 33, or 2000, the function was the same: to keep memory alive until it could be spoken in a setting capable of hearing it. In the archives of coverage, clippings remain. Some circle the figure 6 in red ink, others underline 33 in black. Each carries a different headline, a different attempt to fix an exact total, but what mattered in the end was not the number reported but the recognition itself. On a desk in the aftermath, a stack of these clippings sits in uneven pile. The numbers vary, the fonts change, but all point to the same conclusion: many voices, one ledger, and a court that finally allowed them to be heard. At the conclusion of proceedings, the survivor was permitted to deliver a victim impact statement. In legal practice, such statements are intended to convey consequence, the enduring effects of crime beyond the date of the offense. Here, the statement became more than testimony. It was a record of survival translated into formal language and entered into the court's permanent archive. The themes were stark but measured. She described daily life shaped by fear, the repetition of threat that left no space for safety. What had once been described by the judge as calculated and planned was now given weight through her own account, framed in clinical terms rather than narrative. The emphasis lay not on describing acts, but on describing outcomes. Fear had become a constant state, woven into every aspect of development. The statement also detailed permanent medical consequences. Reference was made to interventions that altered the body irreversibly, evidence that the damage was not confined to memory, but written into physiology. These injuries stood as proof that the crimes were not only historical but continuing, experienced daily through their effects. Such phrasing ensured the court understood that the harm could not be considered past tense. Equally significant was the focus on the legal process itself. The statement acknowledged the necessity of sentencing, but also addressed the risks of parole. The survivor articulated the re-traumatization that repeated hearings could inflict, urging the court to impose a structure that would minimize exposure to future proceedings. In this way, the impact statement functioned not only as testimony, but as a request for protection within the justice system. Observers noted the restraint with which the words were delivered. There was no excess, no dramatic flourish. The strength lay in precision, the controlled use of language to body harm in terms the court could not dismiss. Each phrase was measured, chosen as though it belonged in a ledger rather than in conversation. It was this very restraint that gave the statement its evidentiary power. The judge listened in silence, later acknowledging the clarity and credibility of what had been presented. For the court, the impact statement crystallized the lived consequences of crimes described in indictments and charge sheets. It transformed the abstract language of law, counts, dates, sections of legislation, into human cost, presented in the same deliberate tone as the rest of the case. In the official archive, the statement now exists as typed pages, double-spaced, filed with the transcript. Its words will remain there long after the sentence is served, accessible to future readers of the record. It represents not only a summary of harm, but also a form of resistance, language that turned survival into evidence, precision into permanence. On the clerk's desk, the transcript rested before signatures were applied, pages clipped together, edges slightly curled, the document waited to be sealed into the file. In that quiet stack of paper lay the words the court chose to keep, an impact statement transformed into history. Sentencing took place in the Downing Centre District Court in Sydney, under the authority of Judge Sarah Huggett. The proceedings did not rush. They unfolded with the cadence of judicial formality, each number delivered as if marking the strike of a clock. Years of investigation, testimony, and archival reconstruction condensed into a handful of sentences that would fix the duration of a life in confinement. The judge outlined the scale of the offending, describing it in the same terms she had used throughout the proceedings: planned, calculated, depraved, and abhorrent. Her words were chosen with precision, each one drawn from the language of the court rather than emotion. In legal context, these descriptors carried weight equal to evidence. They served as the foundation on which punishment was built. The sentence was set at 45 years imprisonment. Within that figure, the court established a non-parole period of 33 years. The arithmetic mattered. It meant that parole would not be considered until the 2050s, by which time the offender would be of advanced age. In effect, the sentence acknowledged both the scale of the crimes and the need to shield the survivor from the re-traumatization of repeated parole hearings. The delivery was procedural. The docket number was read, the charges recited, and the penalty attached to each. Time, once experienced by the survivor as a loop of fear, was here transformed into a measure of justice, years quantified, calculated, and imposed. The courtroom's silence during this delivery underscored the gravity of the moment. For the record, the judge noted the unprecedented nature of the case. It was not only the severity of the offences, but the manner in which testimony had been presented, through multiple identities, that distinguished it. Yet when judgment was handed down, the focus shifted from novelty to accountability. Numbers replaced narrative, dates replaced memory, and the ledger of harm found its counterpart in the ledger of law. Observers outside the courtroom translated these figures into headlines. For the legal file, they were entered plainly: 45 years, 33 non-parole. The transcript contained no inflection, only the structured outline of a sentence intended to match the magnitude of the case. To the survivor, the figures represented both closure and continuation. Justice had been measured in decades, but the work of survival remained daily. The system of identities would persist, managing memory and function long after the sentence was set. Still, the weight of numbers provided recognition. The state had acknowledged in its strongest terms that the harm was deliberate, calculated, and enduring. In the court's archive, these details are preserved in black ink on white paper bound into the case file. Alongside the charges, the sentencing remarks, and the victim impact statement, the figures stand immovable. On a wall calendar projected forward by the registry, a square is marked 33 years beyond the date of sentencing. The page is otherwise blank, silent about what life will look like then. Yet the mark remains, a reminder that justice in this instance has been calibrated in decades, not days. When the sentencing ended, the ledger of testimony did not close, it shifted form. What had been delivered in transcripts and judicial remarks was later translated into a book, a controlled release of memory and survival into the public domain. In 2022, Hachette Australia published The Girl in the Green Dress, written by the survivor in collaboration with psychiatrist Dr. George Blair West. The memoir did not attempt to recount every detail. Instead, it presented a curated account, shaped for readers beyond the courtroom, balancing revelation with restraint. The text was an extension of the same system that had enabled survival. Where once thousands of identities had divided memory into fragments, the memoir reassembled those fragments into a structure that could be read line by line. It was neither confession nor spectacle. It was an act of translation, taking complexity that had confounded outsiders and rendering it legible without diminishing its depth. For the first time, the survivor's story could be encountered not only in court records, but on the shelves of ordinary readers. The purpose extended beyond personal testimony. The book served as public education about dissociative identity disorder, demonstrating that multiplicity could be coherent, functional, and credible. It dismantled misconceptions of disorder as chaos by showing that identities had been purpose-built for survival. In doing so, the memoir advanced advocacy for survivors whose conditions are often dismissed or misunderstood. Its tone was measured, echoing the clinical clarity that had marked courtroom testimony, and in this restraint it found authority. Reception acknowledged both its uniqueness and its courage. Reviews noted that the book opened a window into a world few could imagine, while remaining grounded in fact and careful documentation. It became part of a broader conversation on trauma, law, and mental health, ensuring that the lessons of the case did not remain sealed within court transcripts. In interviews and public appearances, the survivor used the book as a platform for advocacy, shifting from witness to educator, from private custodian to public voice. The title itself carried symbolic weight. The girl in the green dress evoked childhood, memory, and a visual anchor that tethered vast complexity to a single, recognizable image. Just as Symphony had preserved the details of curtains and floor tiles, the memoir offered an image to hold on to, a dress that signified both vulnerability and endurance. It reminded readers that beneath the architecture of multiplicity was always a child seeking survival. The publication was not the end of advocacy. Paperback editions in 2023 extended its reach, ensuring continued circulation. Bookstore listings, library catalogues, and retail inventories now carry the name, embedding it into cultural record. What once existed only in hidden compartments of memory is now bound in print, preserved in ISBN numbers and library call codes. On a desk in quiet contrast, a first edition cover rests beside a well-used notebook filled with marginalia. The printed volume is clean, uniform, and public. The notebook remains personal, its penciled notes layered across pages worn thin. Together they symbolize translation, from the private ledger of survival to the public archive of literature. When judgment was handed down and the book was later published, some observers imagined an ending. Yet for the survivor, the system that had preserved her life did not dissolve with a sentence or a publication date. Multiplicity remained, not as spectacle, but as daily maintenance. The same divisions that once absorbed trauma now manage ordinary existence, surfacing when cued by light, smell, or a word that echoes too closely with the past. These identities do not disappear with time. They continue to serve as custodians. Some are summoned when anxiety quickens the pulse, others when memory requires detail. To the outside world, they are invisible. To the survivor, they are essential infrastructure. The system is not static. It adjusts, adapts, negotiates, but its purpose is the same: preservation. Documentary work has begun to make this reality visible to a wider public. Projects such as We Are Jeni have framed the case not only as a legal milestone, but as a cultural question. How do we archive pain that was once dismissed as disorder? These films and discussions attempt to extend recognition beyond a courtroom into a society still learning to grasp the mechanics of dissociation. They present the multiplicity not as pathology, but as a record of survival that continues long after legal judgment is complete. In this way, the ledger is ongoing. Justice concluded one chapter, but healing remains unfinished, daily, unrecorded, except in the shifts between identities that still manage life. Cultural institutions may describe the story as closed, but inside, the archive is still active. The survivor carries forward a system that will likely remain for the rest of her life, not as a remnant of chaos, but as a form of order uniquely her own. There is a paradox in this continuity. A mind once divided to withstand harm now remains divided to sustain living. To dismantle the system would be to dismantle the very mechanism that kept the body alive. What courts and documentaries record as extraordinary is, for the survivor, simply maintenance, a private routine as ordinary as breathing, yet as complex as an archive built over decades. For those who study or observe, the lesson lies less in the detail of identities than in the recognition that survival can take forms the law was never designed to imagine. The case exposed not only one family's violence but also society's need to expand the categories by which it acknowledges truth. Multiplicity in this sense is not only personal, it is cultural. At night, when the day's tasks are complete and the public work is done, the archive continues its quiet labor. The house is closed, the lights are off, and a front door is locked from the inside. Behind it, thousands of identities remain at their stations, each keeping part of the record, each ensuring that the ledger of survival continues to turn its pages unseen.